The sky was not dark. It was bruised. London was burning again. From the cliffs of Dover to the hangars of Kent, the horizon pulsed like a wounded heart. The sound of sirens cut through the night air, and the people below, those who hadn't yet fled, looked upward, waiting for what they could not see. Above them, hidden behind clouds and firelight, came the deep, rhythmic hum of engines. Heinkel, Dornier, Junkers. They came not in one wave, but in endless streams, silver ghosts crossing the channel under the cover of darkness. For the people of Britain, the night sky had become an executioner's stage. But in a quiet laboratory north of London, there was another kind of battle being fought. No guns, no blood. Just a man, a chalkboard, and a problem no one believed could be solved. His name was Robert Watson Watt, not a soldier, not a pilot. A physicist, pale, bespectacled, and perpetually tired, his shirt often dusted with chalk and cigarette ash. But in that moment, his war was no less fierce than the one raging above the clouds, because he was fighting for something even more fragile than the city itself: invisibility. It began with a single question that seemed absurd. Can we make radar itself disappear? The irony was cruel. Just months before, Watson Watt's work had created the very technology that gave Britain its first real defense, the chain-home radar system. It had spotted enemy bombers miles before they reached the coast. It had given the RAF precious minutes to scramble, and it had turned the tide of the Battle of Britain. But the Germans had learned. They began sending false echoes, window decoys of aluminum foil, beams reflected back to confuse the radar. Their scientists, too, were adapting. Soon, British radar stations were being bombed, dismantled, blinded. And so, the man who had made radar visible now faced the impossible. He had to make it invisible. Outside, the bombs kept falling. Inside, Watson Watt stared at the faint green glow of an oscilloscope. The lines danced and trembled, tracing the shape of the unseen. He had spent years studying how radio waves could reveal an aircraft's shadow. Now he was trying to teach those waves to lie. The room smelled of ozone and dust. A single radio transmitter crackled, sending coded pulses into the night. In his notebook he wrote, "If the enemy listens, let them hear only silence." That was the essence of his idea. Camouflage, not for the eye, but for the air. The notion seemed almost mystical, that you could bend a signal, scatter it, hide it among the noise of the ether. But war has a way of turning the impossible into necessity. And for Britain in 1940, necessity was survival. In the months to come, this obscure line of research would give birth to what we now call radio countermeasures, the art of deceiving the enemy's radar. But at that moment, in that quiet room lit by a single desk lamp, no one knew if it would even work. Watson Watt's colleagues called it madness. His superiors called it a civilian curiosity. But the Luftwaffe's bombers were not curious. They were coming, night after night, in greater numbers, with greater precision. And so, Watson Watt stayed. When the lights flickered, he worked by candlelight. When the windows shook from nearby blasts, he taped them back together and kept calculating. His chalkboards filled with strange diagrams, concentric circles, curved arrows, formulas scrawled like battle plans. Each line drawn was a shot fired in a war no one could see. At dawn, when the sirens finally fell silent, London smoldered under a pale sky. The city had survived again, though barely. The people swept glass from their doorways, patched walls, buried their dead. And in a small corner of a military lab, a man quietly erased a formula from the board, muttering to himself. He believed he was close, one frequency, one phase angle away from making Britain's radar disappear from German detection. He did not know it then, but that invisible hand would soon shield entire convoys, protect bomber fleets, and reshape the air war forever. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with guns or tanks, but with silence. And in the long nights of 1940, while the world burned, One man's silence began to change the sound of war itself. The sea is calm, but the air hums with static. Far beyond the mist, in occupied France, the Luftwaffe is lining up for another day's work. Rows of Heinkel bombers sit waiting on wet runways, their crews smoking in silence, listening to the drone of engines warming up. To them, England is a target map, nothing more. Dots of light on the horizon, cities that burn easily, London, Coventry, Portsmouth. Every night their orders are simple: cross the channel, follow the beam, drop the load. And that beam, the Knickebein, was Germany's new weapon. Few on the British side knew how it worked, or even that it existed. It was a navigation system so precise, it could guide a bomber to a single factory block from 200 miles away. 2 radio beams, crossing invisibly over England. Where they intersected, the bomb would fall. The Germans called it scientific war. The British called it witchcraft. But to Robert Watson Watt, it was neither. It was signal interference. Nothing more, nothing less. And that meant, in theory, it could be stopped. By late 1940, Britain's chain-home radar network was the country's nervous system. Dozens of tall steel towers lined the coasts, pulsing invisible waves into the air. When enemy planes approached, the signals bounced back, dots appearing on cathode screens like ghosts flickering to life. For the first time in human history, a nation could see the enemy before the enemy was seen. It was a revolution. But revolutions are fragile things. The Luftwaffe knew this. They had learned to fly low, below the radar horizon. They began jamming signals, sending false echoes, blinding stations at critical moments. And when they couldn't blind them, they bombed them. The war in the air was no longer just about bullets and bombs. It was becoming a war of frequencies. Inside the British Air Ministry, tension ran high. Reports from the coast read like eulogies. Radar station Ventnor destroyed, staff casualties, equipment lost. Engineers worked in shifts, rebuilding what the bombs tore down. Each time they restored one tower, another went dark. And through it all, Watson Watt moved quietly between bases, carrying not weapons but notebooks. His colleagues joked that he traveled like a priest, always calm, always listening. They didn't know that each note he took, each calculation scribbled in the margins, was a step toward changing the invisible battlefield. He wasn't working alone. A handful of scientists, many young, most unarmed, joined him in what would later be called the Y Service. Their mission was to listen, not to people, to signals. Night after night, in huts scattered across the countryside, operators sat wearing headphones, recording every blip, every pulse, every whisper on the airwaves. They mapped the enemy's beams, traced their origins, found their weaknesses. And somewhere in those pages of static, Watson Watt saw a pattern. If the Germans used radio to guide their bombers, then Britain could use radio to lead them astray. That was the seed of radar camouflage, not hiding the stations themselves, but bending the truth of what the enemy's instruments could see. In early 1941, as the Blitz dragged into its most brutal months, the pressure on British scientists became unbearable. The Prime Minister himself demanded results. The cities were suffocating under nightly firestorms. The people slept in the underground. Whole families vanished in the smoke. Yet, amid the chaos, something extraordinary was happening. For the first time, soldiers and scientists were fighting side by side, not on the same battlefield, but for the same reason, to keep Britain alive. One RAF pilot later said, "We didn't know who these men were, but we owed them our lives. Every time the radar lit up, it meant someone, somewhere, was still awake, still listening." Watson Watt's mind was racing faster than the war around him. The problem was no longer about detection, it was about deception. Could they create false echoes, just as the Germans did? Could they hide a radar signal among meaningless noise? Could they cloak an entire station, making it appear as empty sky? Every theory came with risk. Every test could fail, and failure meant more lives lost. But science in wartime has no luxury of safety. So they built decoy transmitters, small, hidden, scattered across the countryside. Each one broadcast false signals, mimicking radar emissions, luring German bombers away from real stations. It was a deadly kind of chess, each move played in the dark, each victory invisible. Sometimes, when the night sky flashed red to the south, Watts and Watt would listen to the distant thunder of bombs and whisper, "They're hitting the fake one." For a moment, that meant someone else had lived, but the Germans adapted too. They changed frequencies, switched tactics, scattered their raids. The air war was no longer predictable. It had become a symphony of confusion, of echoes and counter-echoes. And at its center stood a quiet physicist who refused to sleep. Because he understood something that few others did. If radar had given mankind the power to see the enemy, radio countermeasures would teach them how to hide from him. By the spring of 1941, Britain's survival no longer depended solely on pilots or guns, but on men like Watts and Watt, who fought a war that left no smoke, no bodies, no medals. Only silence. A silence that, for a brief moment, kept an entire nation alive. The war had been raging for 2 years, but here, among hedgerows and fog, the world seemed almost still. A small wooden hut stood near the runway, its windows blacked out with paint, its door guarded by a single sentry. Inside, cigarette smoke hung in the air like mist. This was not a command post. It was not even officially on the map. It was a listening station. And inside, surrounded by tangled cables and oscilloscopes, sat Robert Watts and Watt, staring into the trembling light of a cathode screen. He looked nothing like a hero of war. His suit was crumpled, his tie loose, his hair perpetually disheveled. The years had carved exhaustion into his face, but behind those tired eyes burned the same stubborn fire that had carried him through every night raid, every setback, every sneer from those who once said his radar was a fantasy. Now, he was chasing a new fantasy, to hide the very thing he had created. Outside, the wind carried the distant drone of bombers. Even here, far from the front, the war never truly left. When the siren sounded, he didn't flinch anymore. He simply turned the volume of the receiver higher, as if trying to drown out the world with static. Beside him, a young woman in uniform, barely 20, scribbled notes. Her name was Margaret Stanley, one of the WAF operators assigned to the Y service. Her job was simple. Listen. Her headphones caught the chatter of German transmissions, the coded bursts of the Luftwaffe's night raids, the faint pulse of the Nicobine beams that guided them. But Margaret had begun to notice something strange. The signals were shifting, splintering, fading in ways they hadn't before. She leaned toward Watts and Watt, voice trembling. "Sir, are they learning?" He didn't answer. He just nodded once, quietly, and wrote something down. A single word. Countermeasure. The war had entered a new dimension, one invisible to the eye, but just as lethal. Every frequency Britain jammed, the Germans adjusted. Every fake signal broadcast, they found another wavelength. It was a cat-and-mouse game played at the speed of light. And every night, as bombers crossed the channel, that game determined who would live and who would die. Watts and Watt's colleagues worried for him. He slept barely 3 hours a night. He refused to take leave, refused to see his family. One officer recalled finding him asleep on the floor, a half-eaten sandwich beside a stack of reports. When they asked why he pushed himself so hard, he answered softly, "Because every echo we miss becomes a bomb that lands." It wasn't guilt that drove him. It was duty, an old-fashioned, almost desperate sense of responsibility. He knew radar had changed the war, but he also knew that anything that can be seen can also be blinded. And he feared the day the Germans discovered how. By late 1941, that fear began to take form. German intelligence had intercepted parts of Britain's radar network. They were experimenting with their own versions of jamming, codenamed Freya and Würzburg. The airwaves had become a battlefield, every frequency a front line. And the men fighting it were not soldiers. They were scientists, mathematicians, engineers. They fought with equations instead of rifles, but their casualties were no less real. When radar stations were bombed, these civilians were often the ones inside. When a test failed, it meant the loss of entire squadrons. Their war had no medals, only statistics. One evening, as rain battered the roof of the hut, Margaret asked him quietly, "Sir, do you ever wish you'd never invented it?" He didn't answer immediately. He stared at the screen, watching the faint green pulse fade into darkness. Then he said, "If I hadn't, we'd be blind, and the blind never win wars." He turned to her, eyes hollow but calm. "The trick," he murmured, "is not to see everything, but to know what not to show." That was the essence of radar camouflage, to create silence so convincing, the enemy believed it was truth. Weeks later, he tested his latest experiment, a counter-signal that reflected radar beams not back to the source, but sideways, creating a ghost echo. It was crude, unstable, but it worked. On paper, the Luftwaffe's instruments showed empty air where radar towers stood. The first trial saved a coastal station near Dover. German bombers flew directly over it, dropping their loads on an empty field miles away. It was a small victory, barely noted in the official record. But for Watson Watt, it was proof. Proof that science could lie in the service of survival. That night, he stood outside the hut, smoking in the rain. He looked up at the sky, dark and endless, and whispered to no one, "They'll never see us again." It wasn't triumph. It was relief. The quiet, exhausted kind that comes from knowing how close the world had been to collapse. In that moment, amid the static and rain, the war felt both infinite and fragile. And the man who had once made radar visible had now made it disappear. Not out of pride, but because there was no other way to keep the lights on in Britain. The wind howls across the cliffs. Waves crash against the dark shoreline. In the distance, beyond the mist, an alarm wails. The German bombers are coming again. Inside the small operations hut, the lights dim. The operators lean over their screens. The green line of the cathode flickers like a heartbeat. Each pulse brings a faint echo, each echo a shape in the sky. Contacts confirmed, 30 plus, heading northwest. The voice is calm, but the air feels heavy. Every man in the room knows what 30 bombers can do to a sleeping city. Robert Watson Watt stands behind them, arms folded, eyes fixed on the scope. He doesn't speak. He listens to the static, the hum, the rhythm of approaching death. Then he nods once. "Activate the ghost field." In a small shack a mile away, hidden among dunes, a technician flips a switch. A low-frequency transmitter hums to life, sending out a coded signal, an imitation radar echo, tuned precisely to the Luftwaffe's detection frequency. The invisible trap is set. High above the clouds, the German formation flies steady. Their onboard receivers lock onto a false reflection, a decoy radar site projected miles from the real one. "Target sighted," the lead pilot radios in German. But what they see on their instruments is an illusion, an empty field, flickering with phantom light. They descend. Bomb bay doors open. A rain of explosives falls upon nothing. Inside the true radar hut, no one cheers. They simply wait, silent, as the sound of distant detonations rolls across the coast like thunder. Watson Watt lowers his head, exhales, and whispers, "They're bombing shadows." That night, the decoy system, codenamed Aspirin, saved 3 radar stations and hundreds of lives. It was the first real victory of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with firepower, but with deception. But the victory didn't last long. By early 1942, the Luftwaffe had learned. Their scientists, men like Hans Plendl, Germany's leading radiophysicist, had begun adapting their systems. They recalibrated their beams, cross-checked multiple signals, even sent test aircraft to bait British transmitters. Soon, Asprin's illusions were fading, and the Germans struck back with something new. They called it Y. Jarrett, a guidance system so precise it could measure a bomber's distance from a transmitter within tens of meters. It used a single narrow beam, impossible to triangulate by ordinary means. When the British intelligence intercepted the first Y. Jarrett signals, panic rippled through the Air Ministry. The Germans could now hit targets with near-surgical precision. Factories, docks, power plants. It was the kind of weapon that could turn the tide again. In his small office, Watson Watt studied the intercepted data. Long columns of numbers, frequencies, pulse intervals. To most, they meant nothing. To him, they were a language. He ran his finger down the list and murmured, "They've learned to whisper." The Germans had made their signal faint, focused, narrow, a needle in a haystack. To stop it, Britain would need to build something equally cunning. He called it mandrel. Mandrel was no longer a passive camouflage. It was an active deception field. It flooded the air with noise, drowning out the enemy's beams in a blizzard of false echoes. Instead of hiding, it overwhelmed. Every aircraft equipped with a mandrel unit became a moving storm of interference. To the Luftwaffe's radar, the sky became a blur of static, impossible to navigate. It was chaos, and chaos in war is sometimes the best defense. Inside a Wellington bomber, a mandrel transmitter hums beside the radio operator. The air smells of oil and cold sweat. The operator adjusts the dials, tuning the interference signal. A small light glows green. Mandrel active. Moments later, the radar scopes of nearby German stations go blind. Screens that once showed clear flight paths dissolve into snow. In control rooms along the French coast, Luftwaffe officers shout orders, slamming their fists on dead instruments. What happened to the signal? "Sir, it's everywhere." They cannot see the bombers now. They can only listen to the emptiness. Back in England, Watson Watt watches the test reports come in. Each successful jamming recorded in careful handwriting, each frequency adjusted like the tuning of a symphony. He knows this is working, but at a cost. For every mandrel unit built, another radar station must share its limited parts. The engineers are exhausted, supplies are thin, the RAF is stretched to the limit. Yet night after night, the mandrel storms grow stronger. Then came the Battle of the Beams, the invisible duel that defined the next phase of the war. British countermeasures against German navigation systems. German countermeasures against British radar, each side trying to blind the other in the dark. By mid-1942, the British had expanded their deception network. Aspirin for decoy radar echoes. Mandrel for wide-range jamming. Meekin for false navigation signals. Together, they formed an invisible shield stretching across the British Isles. To German pilots, the sky itself seemed to lie. Beams bent, bearings drifted, targets vanished. The Luftwaffe's precision turned to chaos. Their raids grew erratic, their losses climbed. And though no newspaper ever reported it, no general ever spoke of it on radio broadcasts, the tide of the air war was turning. Not in the skies above London, but in the quiet rooms where men like Watson Watt wrote equations in the dark. Yet even victory carries a shadow. The more successful Britain's deception became, the deeper Watson Watt sank into silence. He stopped giving interviews, stopped answering letters. Colleagues said he had become withdrawn, almost spectral, like the very signals he'd created. He was winning a war no one could see, and it was costing him pieces of himself. One evening, during a test flight, a pilot's mandrel system failed mid-air. The aircraft was caught in a German search beam and shot down over the channel. The crew never returned. When the news reached Watson Watt, he said nothing. He only walked to the blackboard, erased the previous calculation, and wrote, "Every frequency costs a life." He stared at the sentence for a long time, then turned away. By 1943, the Battle of the Beams was largely won. The Luftwaffe's raids grew less frequent, their precision gone. Britain had survived the storm, not because of bigger guns or faster planes, but because of something more subtle: the power to disappear. It was the triumph of silence over sound, the victory of deception over destruction, and the beginning of a new kind of warfare, the war of the invisible. The wind moves through heather and long grass. A car rattles up a narrow road, headlights cutting through the fog. It stops outside a small stone house, windows shuttered, chimney smoking faintly. Robert Watson Watt steps out, briefcase in hand. He has come home. But home feels like a place he no longer belongs to. Inside, the fire burns low. His wife, Margaret Robertson, greets him with a soft smile that hides months of distance. Their daughter runs to him, arms outstretched, but he hesitates before kneeling. For a heartbeat, even the act of holding her feels foreign. The man who once created radar now flinches at touch. His mind is still full of static. At the table, they eat in near silence. The only sound is the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint whine of wind outside. Finally, Margaret breaks it. "You've lost weight." He forces a smile. "Work's been demanding." "You said that the last time, and the time before." He looks down. His food has gone cold. For months, he has lived between two worlds: the chaos of invisible war and the fragile calm of civilian life. The two no longer fit together. He doesn't tell her about the nights when he dreams in waveforms. He doesn't tell her about the sound that never leaves his ears, the hum of transmitters, the pulse of radar echoes. For him, silence has ceased to exist. Later, he stands by the window, looking out into the dark. Overhead, a lone aircraft passes, its engine distant, ghostly. He can't help counting the seconds between its passes. Old habits. Margaret joins him quietly. "Do you ever stop listening?" He doesn't answer. He doesn't know how. Watson Watt returns to London. The war hasn't stopped. His face is thinner, his voice quieter, but his mind sharper than ever. He is no longer the front man of radar. That spotlight has passed. Now he works in shadows, advising, calculating, guiding what Churchill privately calls the invisible core. He reviews after-action reports from recent raids, page after page of figures, signals intercepted, decoys successful, losses recorded. To his assistants, it's data. To him, it's something else entirely. Every line of interference, every false echo, every success carries the weight of those who didn't come back. At a briefing, a young officer reports proudly, "Mandrel interference reduced target accuracy by 60%, sir. Our bombers got through untouched." The room murmurs approval. But Watson Watt's face stays still. He looks at the next page, where another squadron, one without Mandrel coverage, never returned. 60%, he says softly. "What about the other 40? The officer blinks, unsure how to answer. Watson Watt closes the folder. "Remember that number," he says. "That's the cost of not being invisible." The war is still raging, but the momentum has shifted. The Allies now plan large-scale deception operations, using radar illusions to mask invasion routes, distort troop movements, create phantom fleets. Watson Watt's early theories have evolved into full-scale strategy. His equations have become instruments of misdirection, mathematics turned into mirage. But with every success, the same question gnaws at him. If war is won by lies, what happens to truth when peace returns? One night, he receives a telegram. It's from a test station near Dover, the same site saved by his first ghost field. Mandrel array malfunction. 3 men lost, 1 missing. He reads it once, folds it neatly, and puts it in his pocket. He doesn't tell anyone. He simply goes back to work. The room hums with machinery. Wires snake across the floor. Oscilloscopes glow like pale moons. Watson Watt sits alone at a workbench, sketching a new schematic, something beyond radar, beyond detection itself. A blind spot generator, he calls it. A way to erase even the shadow of a signal. He knows it's theoretical, perhaps impossible. But still, he writes, line after line, the equations tightening like nooses around his mind. At last, he stops, rubs his temples, and mutters, "I've made men blind. Now I want to make them see again." He tears the page out, folds it once, and locks it away. The war is entering its final act. The Allies prepare for the greatest deception in history, Operation Fortitude. The plan to disguise the D-Day invasion site using false radio traffic, fake divisions, and radar illusions. Watt's fingerprints are everywhere, though few know it. His systems guide phantom convoys across the Channel, broadcast counterfeit signals to mislead German reconnaissance. For weeks, German radar reports show massive fleets approaching Calais, when in truth the real invasion force gathers miles away in Normandy. The ghosts he built now march under false banners, and they will save thousands, but he himself will not be there to see it. By mid-1944, his health collapses. Exhaustion, ulcers, insomnia. He's sent to a quiet post in Canada for rest. He doesn't fight the decision. He simply packs his briefcase and leaves. At the railway platform, his colleagues salute. He nods, murmurs a soft goodbye, and boards the train. As it pulls away, one of the younger engineers turns to another. "Do you think he knows what he's done?" The other replies, "No one will. Not for a long time." Watt walks along the frozen edge of a lake. The war is still raging across the Atlantic, but here there is only stillness. For the first time in years, there's no static. He stops, looks out over the ice, and listens. The silence feels heavy. He takes a deep breath and whispers, "It's over." But even as he says it, he knows it isn't. Some wars don't end when the guns fall silent. Some wars live on inside the people who fought. Them, in the echoes, in the frequencies, in the ghosts that never stop whispering. The war is over. The guns are silent, the searchlights dimmed, the blackout curtains pulled down at last. London's sky, once a patchwork of smoke and fire, shines blue again. In Trafalgar Square, crowds cheer. Bells ring. Flags bloom from every window. But in the quiet outskirts, in laboratories and control huts long abandoned, the machines still hum faintly, as if reluctant to stop. The invisible war has ended, but its ghosts remain. Robert Watson Watt returns to Britain in the late summer of 1945. The journey feels dreamlike. The faces at the docks are younger, fresher. The uniforms are clean. He carries a single suitcase and a satchel of papers no one will ever read in public. At the customs desk, an officer glances at his documents. Occupation. Watson Watt hesitates, then, with a faint smile, "Radar mechanic." The man nods, unaware that this unassuming scientist helped decide the fate of nations. In a small, dimly lit room, Watson Watt sits with two government officials. They thank him politely, present a brief commendation. Nothing more. Radar had been a state secret. Now, as peace returns, so does silence. The officials speak in bureaucratic tones. "Your work was, of course, invaluable, but the details must remain classified, for national security." He nods, expression unreadable. He understands. The war that was never seen will never be celebrated. Outside in the corridor, he meets an old colleague, Edward Bowen, another pioneer of radar research. They shake hands awkwardly like strangers. Bowen smiles sadly. "Seems they're already forgetting us, Robert." Watson Watt shrugs. "That's what we were good at, being unseen." They share a quiet laugh. It feels almost like grief. In the months that follow, the country rebuilds. The war gives way to peacetime industries. Television, navigation, meteorology, all born from the ashes of radar research. The same invisible waves that once guided bombers now guide airplanes across continents. But for those who created it, there is no celebration. The scientists disperse, some to universities, some to private firms, some, like Watson Watt, to solitude. He takes a small advisory role at the Ministry of Civil Aviation, helping adapt radar for air traffic control. It is honest, quiet work. Yet the people around him speak of new inventions, as if radar had just been discovered. He never corrects them. A young physics student raises his hand during a public seminar. "Sir, who invented radar?" The lecturer smiles. "Well, that's rather complicated. The Americans claim credit, the Germans had early versions, and the British, well, they had their own system." Watson Watt sits quietly in the back row. He doesn't raise his hand. He simply listens, the corners of his mouth turning upward, not in pride, but in weary acceptance. Fame was never his goal. Survival was. Television now fills British homes. Airliners crisscross the skies. A new world of communication hums with invisible energy. In this world, radar has become ordinary, an everyday miracle no one questions. Ships use it, weather stations use it, even police cars. And the name Watson Watt appears only occasionally, in footnotes or brief interviews. He is knighted in 1942, but by the time the world learns what he truly did, it has already moved on, to rockets, to satellites, to the next frontier. The host introduces him as Sir Robert Watson Watt, pioneer of radar. He clears his throat softly, adjusts his glasses. "I am often asked," he says with gentle humor, "if I feel proud to have invented radar. To which I usually reply, I'm proud it worked." The audience laughs politely, but his tone grows quieter. Pride is for those who have forgotten what it cost. Radar didn't win the war. It merely gave us time to survive it. Watson Watt stands before a small group of young engineers. He draws a single line on the chalkboard, a simple wave pattern. "This," he says, "was how we learned to see the unseen. But never forget, every invention, no matter how noble, has two faces. One shows us the world more clearly. The other hides us from ourselves." He pauses, then adds softly, "War taught me that truth and deception share the same wavelength." The students don't quite understand. They applaud politely. He leaves the chalk untouched. The house is quiet. Papers line the desk, yellowed by age. He spends his days writing letters, sketches, fragments of memoirs that will never be published. In one of his notes, found years later, he writes, "Our greatest triumph was invisibility, but the price of being unseen is being forgotten." He folds the page, signs it simply, RWW, and leaves it in a drawer. Radar evolves into sonar, LiDAR, Doppler, microwave, GPS, each born from the same principle: reflection, invisibility, deception turned into detection. Airliners land safely in fog. Ships navigate through storms. Astronomers map the unseen edge of the universe. The world thrives on echoes. And yet, almost no one remembers the man who first taught machines to listen. The radar towers still stand along the British coast, their concrete walls weathered by decades of wind and rain. Most have been converted into museums, storage sites, or left to crumble into history. Visitors walk past exhibits without realizing that the hum of every airport scanner, every motion detector, every storm radar traces back to a single thought scribbled in the mind of a tired Scottish physicist in 1935. A thought that changed how humanity sees. History remembers the wars of tanks and bombs, of generals and kings. But there was another war, fought in silence, across invisible frontiers. A war of mathematics, of patience, of light against darkness. Robert Watson Watt never sought glory. He built a shield so perfect it made its makers disappear. In that silence, he gave the world something more than victory. He gave it the power to survive its own blindness. The Cold War hums in the background like static. Across the North Sea, radar dishes now turn not toward bombers, but missiles. Men in underground bunkers watch glowing screens for blips that could end the world in minutes. In Inverness, far from it all, Robert Watson Watt sits by a window overlooking the Scottish hills. The world he helped protect has grown louder, faster, and infinitely more dangerous. He watches jet trails in the sky, white scars cutting across the blue, and mutters softly, "Still chasing ghosts on the radar." He knows the irony too well. The technology that once shielded Britain now guards the entire planet, but it also keeps it on edge. Invisibility was once a weapon. Now it is everywhere. In stealth bombers, in espionage, in the way nations hide behind signals and screens. He closes his eyes. The hum of the modern world sounds eerily like the first oscillators he built in a hut near Bawdsey Manor. He smiles faintly. "Everything returns to static," he says. In 1973, at age 81, Robert Watson Watt passes away quietly in Canada. No fanfare, no headlines. A local paper prints a small obituary. Sir Robert Watson Watt, radar pioneer, dies. There is no parade, no wreaths of state, only a brief moment of silence in a few old laboratories, where aging engineers look up from their desks and remember a man who once told them, "Listen carefully, the air itself speaks." The war veterans who knew his name are already fading, one by one. To the younger generation, radar is as ordinary as the telephone. But history, like radar, always echoes, faintly, then more clearly with time. A child stands before a cracked concrete tower on the edge of the North Sea. The wind howls through rusted antenna frames. A guide's voice explains how these towers once saw enemy aircraft long before they appeared. The child asks, "Who built it?" The guide pauses. His name was Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist. He made Britain see in the dark. The child nods, though he doesn't understand. But something about the phrase, "see in the dark," stays with him. The world is once again ruled by signals. Wi-Fi, radar, GPS, satellites, invisible waves fill the air Watson Watt once called the ocean of ether. In airports, controllers still stare at glowing screens, guiding lives through invisible corridors. In weather stations, storm fronts bloom like slow explosions on radar maps. In hospitals, machines pulse waves through human hearts, searching for life within the noise. And somewhere in that vast, unseen network, in every reflection, every pulse, echoes the same principle Watson Watt once drew on a scrap of paper. A wave goes out, hits something, and comes back. A signal, and an echo. Action, and consequence. A bronze statue is unveiled, the first to bear his full likeness. He stands quietly, coat drawn against the wind, gazing toward the horizon. In his hand, a small radar antenna. An inscription below reads, "He gave us eyes where there was once only darkness." Veterans, students, and a few surviving engineers attend. One old man in the crowd whispers, "He never wanted glory, only clarity." The ceremony ends. The wind carries the sound of bagpipes, low, solemn, almost like the static hum of an old cathode tube warming up. Every war leaves its ruins in stone and memory, but the invisible wars, the ones fought in silence, leave no ruins at all, only echoes. Radar began as a means to survive, but its legacy became something greater, the foundation of a connected world. A world that listens, measures, and reflects. A world forever caught between knowing and not knowing, between seeing and being seen. Watson Watt's name fades in and out of textbooks, like a signal fading on the edge of detection. But each time an airliner finds its way through fog, each time a ship avoids a hidden reef, each time a storm is tracked before it destroys, his invisible hand still guides the world he once helped protect. The camera drifts upward, from the old radar tower, through clouds, past airliners, satellites, weather balloons, into the dark silence of space. Below, the Earth glows faintly in the darkness. From this height, the invisible lines of communication shimmer like a web of light, the same principle that once shielded Britain now enveloping the entire planet. And somewhere, in the hum of the cosmos, one more signal travels outward, seeking, reflecting, returning, an eternal echo of the man who first made the air itself speak. Robert Watson Watt's greatest invention was not radar. It was faith. Faith that even in the darkest storm, humanity could find a way to see. He gave us eyes in the dark, and even now, long after his signal faded, the world still listens for its echo. The glow of monitors paints the faces of air traffic controllers in pale green light. No bombers, no sirens. Only passenger flights drifting calmly through digital skies. Outside, the world sleeps. Inside, invisible waves hum ceaselessly. Radar, radio, satellite, signal, the heartbeat of civilization. A faint echo on the screen. A signal reflected back from the void. An image is formed, not of danger now, but of presence. Someone out there, someone returning. That is radar, not about war, but about return. Every pulse, every reflection, a whisper that says, "You are not alone in the dark." Robert Watson Watt never saw radar as a weapon. He saw it as an act of trust, a way to see without striking, to know without destroying. In an age when men blinded each other with bombs, he taught the world how to see again. The irony is haunting. He invented the art of invisibility and was buried by it. He made the unseen visible and disappeared himself. History remembers the generals, the soldiers, the flags waving above the smoke. But somewhere, behind every victory, there is always a quiet man in a lab, building the tools that make others visible, while remaining unseen himself. Grass now grows through cracks in the concrete. The wind whistles through the skeleton of a steel tower, the same sound that once carried across the English coast when the Luftwaffe came in waves. Only seabirds patrol here now. But if you close your eyes, the echoes remain, the hum of machinery, the distant call of a siren, the voice of a man saying softly, "Listen, the air speaks. Every war ends, but its inventions never die. They slip quietly into peace, changing names, changing purpose. Radar became weather. Weather became navigation. Navigation became communication. And now every phone in every pocket carries the same invisible pulse that once guarded the coast of Britain. The world Watson Watt helped build has grown smaller, brighter, and more crowded with invisible light. We see everything now. Satellites peer into storms. Drones trace every movement. Algorithms map every mind. But somewhere in all this light, a question lingers. Have we learned to see, or have we only learned to watch? When Robert Watson Watt died, few noticed. But his silence may have been his final message. That true vision, real understanding, doesn't come from seeing everything. It comes from knowing what to see and when to stop looking. His invention gave humanity eyes across the darkness, but it also reminded us that the unseen still matters, that mystery still breathes between the waves, that not everything should be revealed by the sweep of a green line. The war ended long ago. The machines are silent now, but the echoes remain, not of battle, but of the men and women who once believed that even in darkness, we could learn to see. Robert Watson Watt's story is not about invention, nor victory, nor loss. It is about faith, that in the vast silence between signals, something will always come back.